emperor's body stirred in the sealed coffin, standing at the altar of St. Remigius Cathedral. One of the pallbearers collapsed and fainted. The priest, holding the censer, turned around and dropped the vessel. Smoke billowed across the floor, and in an instant the temple was filled with screams. By order of the Arch-Chancellor, the lid was not opened. "This is God's judgment," he said. The coffin continued to be carried. Emperor Oldebald VI, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire from 1416, spent the last weeks of his life in a small stone hall in the fortress of Brunach, on the border of Lorraine. The windows were covered with cloth and boards by his order. He was afraid of drafts and eyes that, as he claimed, were watching him from behind the shutters. According to his valet's letters, by the end of May, his urine had become cloudy with sediment, his breathing was wheezy, and his speech was incoherent. Swelling appeared on his legs and stomach, and the skin on his ankles turned black. The court physician, Master Gottfried of Bamberg, wrote in his report, his stomach was swollen like a wineskin, and inside there was a gurgling sound like a brew stinking of rotten eggs. The emperor refused to eat. Servants mixed ground poppy seeds into his broth to silence his cries for at least half an hour. On some nights, they could be heard even in the lower courtyard. According to the prison cook, Chronicle of Rudolf of Feldberg, Aldebrecht accused everyone of conspiracy: his son, his confessor, the wives of his deceased brothers. He screamed that they had all crawled into his liver and were sucking it from the inside. The valet claimed that the emperor tried to tear out his own fingernails when the pain in his side began, and indeed, after the autopsy, bleeding beds and traces of pus were found under the fingernails of both hands. Aldebart's liver was decomposing. According to the conclusion recorded in the so-called Wenceslas manuscript, he suffered from a severe form of dropsy, aggravated by prolonged mercury poisoning and parasite bites. The latter, as indicated in the treatise by physician Ulrich Vogel, caused loosening of the tissue and decay even before the pulse stopped. Rumors circulated in the palace that the emperor was being slowly cursed by monks, whom he had previously expelled from Metz, and that he saw the ghost of the bishop who had been hanged on his orders. According to reports from the secretary of the secret chancellery, every morning the emperor demanded that a lit candle be brought to him, and, in a barely audible whisper, listed the names of those he had ordered to be strangled, thrown into the river, or poisoned. One of the servants heard him say, "I cannot remove them. They are in the blood of my fingers." In the first week of June, 3 different doctors were summoned to him. One of them, an old man from Strasbourg, suggested heating iron and cauterizing his stomach to release the evil. The second, a former apothecary of the Bishop of Worms, gave him an ointment made of lard, copper, and snake teeth. The emperor screamed and tore off the bandage a few hours later. The skin on his chest burst open, revealing an ulcer in the shape of a blurry circle. Pus oozed out, accompanied by a faint smell of rotten fish. After that, no one was allowed to approach the emperor's body, except for a eunuch with a tub of water. None of the legitimate heirs were allowed to enter the chambers. The stone doors were locked with 2 locks. The guards were changed every 4 hours. Vessels containing excrement were carried out of the courtyard and covered with cloth. According to Clement's servant, one of them was accidentally knocked over, and its contents were almost black. By the time the Arch-Chancellor and the trusted Bishop of Basel arrived at the fortress, Aldebart was almost unrecognizable. His eyes were sunken, his lips were parched, his tongue was cracked and red like boiled meat, wrote the chronicler of St. John's Monastery. Toward the middle of June, the emperor stopped speaking. Due to swelling of his vocal cords and inflammation of his tongue, he could only emit wheezing and convulsive sobs. Blood flowed from his nostrils every day. He was turned over every 4 hours, but the bed sores festered. His clothes stuck to his body and had to be cut off with a knife. The hole in his side swelled up and was covered with a gray-green film that felt like cold dough to the touch. Curse or disease, poison or divine punishment. By the the 20th day of the month, people in the castle were openly whispering about his death. Documents were not signed, seals were not affixed. The Imperial Council gathered secretly in Koblenz. During the night, one of the guards reported hearing footsteps at the Emperor's bedroom door. Although no one had entered, the Emperor did not die immediately. He fought. He scratched at the bed, howled, and bit one of the servants to the bone when he tried to give him medicine. Only at dawn on the 24th did his breathing stop, or, as the later chronicle, The Night Voice, claims, he was forced to silence by pressing a pillow to his face to end his suffering. His body was immediately prepared for embalming, but when they opened his abdomen, at least 2 liters of ink-like liquid, swarming with worms, poured out. A servant standing at the head of the bed fainted. Another vomited. The Arch-Chancellor ordered that the body be closed immediately and the coffin sealed, without even waiting for the chaplain to arrive. The Emperor was declared dead from internal feverish decay sent from above. The coffin with the body of Emperor Aldebart IV wasn't carried out of the Brunna fortress until evening. The stone corridors were filled with the smell of rotting flesh and spilled blood. Due to the rapid decomposition of the internal organs, the sarcophagus could not be sealed tightly. Pus seeped through the cracks, and the wood began to warp. The smell was so strong that the soldiers standing guard were given linen bandages soaked in vinegar. According to the senior constable, one of them tore off the bandage and shouted that the Emperor is still breathing in the box. The next day, the first delegates from the Council of Princes arrived at the castle, to whom neither a manifesto nor a printed decree on the transfer of power had been sent. This gave rise to speculation as to whether Aldebrecht was actually alive. Due to the lack of a public display of the body, many began to claim that he was being hidden in order to alter his will or prepare a new order of succession. The Count of Burgundy demanded that the coffin be opened in the presence of church officials, but his request was denied. The Arch-Chancellor replied, "He who wore the Iron Crown mustn't be touched. His decomposition is God's business, not man's." Meanwhile, the body continued to decay inside the sarcophagus. 3 days after his death, the bottom of the coffin began to leak. It was forced to be moved to the lower hall, where the walls were covered with black cloth and the doors were locked. Access to the room was restricted to 2 eunuchs and a monk healer, who fumigated the room with incense. From the diary of the apothecary Hans von Nassen. By the evening of the 40th day, the entrails had leaked through the boards, and worms were scurrying across the floor, crawling under the nails of the living. The Arch-Chancellor was forced to turn to the city doctors. The oldest master embalmer from Basel was summoned. However, when he arrived, the body was beyond repair. All the orifices were swollen, pus was flowing from the eye sockets, and the skin had fallen off the shoulder blades. The only thing that could be done was to wrap the remains in several layers of cloth soaked in resin, cover them with pine needles and lime. Nevertheless, the stench did not disappear. When the coffin was carried out through the chapel, the choir was supposed to sing a funeral song. But on that day, 3 singers suddenly lost their voices. 2 began bleeding from the nose, and the 3rd fainted. One of the monastery novices later stated during questioning that he sang not for the repose of the dead, but for the salvation of the living. These rumors were reinforced by the claim of one of the bodyguards that during the night he heard movement coming from the hall where the body lay, and the smell of sulfur and honey wafted from the door. The political crisis was growing. The heir, Prince Gerhard, was under house arrest in Aachen after his unsuccessful speech against the emperor's reforms. He wrote in his letter to the Archbishop of Trier, "If my father is buried in silence, then the truth is also being buried." Copies of this letter began to circulate among the nobility. Within a few days, a secret council was convened, and some of the electors decided not to recognize the will, allegedly left to the younger bastard Aldebart, the child of a sea concubine. A conflict arose among the courtiers. Advisor Konrad von Merzbach a longtime opponent of the emperor's religious policy, declared that he was not even worthy of the catacombs, for he died with a black soul and a body that was rotten even in life. He was found 2 days later, with his throat cut in his cell. The secret guard's report stated, "There are no signs of a struggle, but worms were crawling on the floor, which had not been seen in the stone tower before." The church insisted on burial in the Cathedral of St. Remigius, but it was decided to deliver the coffin with the body there at night, without announcing the route to avoid public unrest. Nevertheless, rumors spread. A crowd gathered at the gates of Metz along the way, and one of the cart drivers shouted, "He's still moving! He's trying to get out!" The Arch-Chancellor ordered him to be beaten to death so that the voice of the dead would not drown out the voice of authority. Emperor Aldebald was to find peace in the main crypt, but the crypt was flooded. The stone vaults had collapsed, and water from underground springs had flooded the sarcophagi. In desperation, the body was moved to the upper hall. It was there, on the 4th day after that what is described in the monastery's darkest records happened. During the liturgy, at the cry of, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord," the lid of the coffin shook and fell to the floor, and amid the darkness, a muffled, barely discernible sound rang out, either a breath, a groan, or a movement inside. No one approached. When the lid of Emperor Aldebald IV's coffin collapsed onto the slab, the sound of its fall rolled across the vault of the chapel like a roll of thunder. The priests, who were celebrating the funeral mass, froze. One of the young deacons cried out, but was immediately dragged behind the curtain. Official reports stated an accidental displacement of wood occurred due to dampness, but private letters intercepted by the guards said the coffin was breathing. After the incident, the church service was interrupted. The Arch-Chancellor ordered the remains to be immediately transferred to a crypt under the Laclos fortress, located in a dilapidated monastery outside the city limits. The departure took place late at night, under the cover of 2 detachments of spearmen. The coffin was wrapped in chains and shackled with iron, through which, as eyewitnesses later wrote, drops of pus still seeped. The monks of Laclos refused to accept the body, claiming that the dead man would not rest in peace. The official version, announced by Archdeacon Thessalonian, said that the refusal was due to epidemic fears and insufficient ventilation in the crypt. However, reports from the city clerk S. Roeder state the emperor's corpse was giving off heat. At night, rats gathered around the coffin, untouched even by poisoned grain. They sat, waited, watched. Only one of the servants dared to chase them away. 2 days later, he choked to death on black blood. At the same time, news spread in Aachen that Aldebert's younger bastard, 6-year-old Etzel, had been secretly taken to the Abbey of St. Rupert and crowned there in the name of his living father. The church did not confirm this information, but did not deny it either. Opponents of this line in the council began preparations for an emergency coronation synod without waiting for the official death. This caused a wave of unrest. Crowds gathered at the palace, shouting that the dead man holds the throne while the living scrape for the coffin. Meanwhile, the Iron Crown began to visibly decay. For the first time in the history of the dynasty, the steel was covered with black spots. When an attempt was made to remove the crown from the deceased's head, the iron tore through the skin, and a thick green liquid with a pungent vinegar smell spurted from the crown of the head. One of the servants who touched the crown died on the 3rd day, with swollen gums and puffy eyelids. The monk, who performed the purification ritual, wrote in his diary, "The iron has begun to rot along with the flesh. This is a sign it must not be carried." The Arch-Chancellor convened a secret council again, and it was decided that the body should be buried immediately, without publicity, without singing, and without anyone present. However, the church authorities demanded that at least the formal rites be observed. A compromise was reached. The coffin would be nailed shut, wrapped in 3 layers of silk, fumigated with incense, and buried in the catacombs beneath the monastery of Saint Ulrika. During the funeral procession, another incident occurred. One of the mules pulling the cart carrying the body suddenly reared up, broke free from the harness, and ran into a roadside chapel. Witnesses claimed that the animal screamed like a human being. This circumstance was recorded in the chronicle of the monk Augustine. The animal raged before the grave, where the unclean soul was laid. The burial itself took place in silence, but even after the burial, a foul-smelling fog lingered within the monastery walls. Servants complained of headaches and insomnia, and one of the senior abbots fled his cell, shouting that the dead man was calling him by name. On the third day, a crack appeared in one of the walls of the crypt from the inside. The masons who came down to repair it found that the chains on the coffin had sagged and the iron crown was missing. It was never found. According to one version, the crown broke off and sank into the rotting mixture inside. According to another, it had been removed long before the burial and was now lost, and with it, all succession to power. Meanwhile, the princely council was divided. Some insisted on the immediate coronation of Prince Gerhard, while others demanded that the arch-chancellor be tried for violating funeral canons. The people began to worry. Rumors spread that the dead man had cursed the city, and if the proper liturgy was not performed, a plague would break out in the country. Priests complained that during services, candles went out and icons sweated resin. The body of Emperor Oldebard Svopr did not become a symbol of greatness. It became a symbol of damnation. Its decay continued even after death, consuming the remnants of order, power, and fear. And the more his flesh rotted, the more the empire itself fell apart. When clouds gathered outside the windows of St. Eligius' palace and rain poured down on the Liad roofs, the emperor's body, wrapped in a triple shroud of damp wool and bleached linen, still lay in the lower burial chamber, locked from the outside. The last hours were filled with an uneasy silence, broken only by the stench coming from the door, which had not been opened for 2 days. According to the palace physician, Jeanette of Tours, the body temperature remains unacceptably high, and the lips are black, but the teeth are chattering. None of the courtiers dared to enter. Chaplain Bergier wrote in his report, "The emperor was dead, but he continued to make noises." On the third day, after the official announcement of Aldebrecht for his death, a small council was convened to discuss the funeral. But the sarcophagus, made of elm and covered with iron sheets, began to creak as soon as it was brought into the main hall of the temple. A servant who touched the lid later claimed that he felt movement from inside, and a blow like that of an animal. These words reached the ears of the arch-chancellor, and it was ordered that the lid be nailed shut with nails through the canvas so as not to cause a commotion. That same evening, the coffin was consecrated, but during the ceremony, the censer was knocked over twice, and the choir lost its rhythm. One of the young singers fainted when a large black fly fell on his shoulder from the vault. It later emerged that the internal organs had not been removed during embalming. The body was swelling, and in some areas the skin was cracking, releasing a liquid resembling sour milk. The chronicle of the monk Aurelius records, "It smelled as if porridge was boiling in the bones, but with rot." The burial was scheduled for the evening, in the hope that darkness would hide any possible disfigurement. However, while carrying the sarcophagus, one of the bearers, a monk from Orleans, stumbled, and the coffin hit a stone step. At that moment, a faint but distinct moan came from inside, described by an eyewitness as a gurgling sound turning into a cry. The crowd began to disperse, the clergy trembled, and only the captain of the royal guard gave the order to continue. His words, "Even if he is alive, he is already dead," would later be recorded in the archives as the greatest betrayal of the crown. The body was buried in the presence of only 8 people. Immediately after it was lowered into the crypt, stones were placed on the coffin to prevent it from opening. Rumors spread throughout the courtyard that one of the Sisters of Mercy had heard a cry from under the ground at night, similar to a whisper in Old French. The funeral bells continued to ring for 3 days, not by order, but by the order of the deacon on duty, who assured that the ringing must cover the call from within. 4 days later, pus began to ooze from the tomb, and the stone cracked. The floor of the chapel smelled of rotten salt, ammonia, and warm blood. Monks wearing masks were sent down, but 2 of them returned covered in a rash and in a state of confusion. One threw himself into the monastery well, shouting that the crown is still shining. Political chaos began the very next day. 3 men simultaneously laid claim to the throne: the son from the first marriage, the son from a morganatic union, and a nephew from Burgundy. Unrest broke out in the city. 2 monasteries were set on fire, considering them cursed, and Bishop Ludevsky declared that the state now belongs to the dead. The Parliament archives contain the following record. On the first day without Aldebar, not a single prayer was said aloud. Diplomats from Naples withdrew their embassies, demanding an exhumation. Priests refused to celebrate Mass until it was proven that the emperor was indeed dead. The Archbishop of Paris secretly left for Avignon to avoid involvement in the dispute over succession. The people, deprived of their leader, began to pray to the spirit of the deceased, asking him not to return. The conclusion of this whole story can be found in a note written by the monk Ambroise 2 decades later. Aldebar's bones were no longer sought. The crypt was filled with lead, and his name was erased from the all-new chronicles, but on the south wall of the temple remained a black mark resembling a hand with 8 fingers. They say he was alive when the choir sang.